In a bustling city courtroom, a sense of tension hung in the air as people filed in and out of the room. Whispers of the day's cases echoed off the cold stone walls. It was an ordinary morning in the courtroom of Judge Robert Fenton, who sat behind the bench with his usual stern expression, his gray hair neatly combed back, and his eyes scanning the room as he waited for the next case to begin. He had built a reputation over the years as a no-nonsense judge, quick to rule and even quicker to impose fines or sentences. His reputation was well known among lawyers and defendants alike. Some saw him as a symbol of justice, while others whispered about his rigid and unforgiving nature. Today, he would face someone who was not about to let the law be wielded unfairly. Maria Williams stepped into the courtroom with her head held high, her tall frame and sharp features commanding attention. She was dressed in professional attire, but there was an undeniable strength in the way she moved. She had spent years working her way up from humble beginnings to become a respected attorney, known for her unyielding dedication to her clients. She had dealt with her fair share of prejudices over the years, but had always found a way to push through despite the barriers in front of her. This was her first time appearing in Judge Fenton's courtroom, and she was fully aware of his reputation, though she wasn't afraid of the challenge. As she approached the bench, the judge glanced up from his papers, his eyes scanning her before quickly returning to the file in front of him. Maria noticed the brief look of indifference in his eyes and her gut tightened, but she refused to let it show. She had been in courtrooms enough to know when a judge was about to make a snap judgment. She placed her case file in front of her and addressed the court in a calm but firm voice, explaining the minor traffic violation that had led to this hearing, a parking ticket that had been overlooked due to an error in the system. Judge Fenton listened carefully, his face betraying little emotion as he nodded his head every now and then, but there was an unmistakable air of impatience that seemed to radiate from him. He wasn't one for lengthy explanations or excuses, and he certainly wasn't one to show much empathy towards those who stood before him. Maria could feel the judgment in the room, and it made her more determined to stick to the facts and not be swayed by his presence. She knew she was in the right, but she also knew that in this courtroom the truth wasn't always enough. When the time came for Judge Fenton to make his ruling, he did so swiftly, his voice echoing in the room as he imposed a hefty fine for the infraction, $500. He didn't offer an explanation or even ask if she had anything to add. His decision was final. Without hesitation, Maria's heart sank, but she remained composed. She knew that fighting back here in this moment would only add fuel to the fire, so she accepted the ruling with dignity. Despite the anger she felt bubbling up inside her, she could feel the weight of his gavel falling down on her, not just as a defendant, but as a black woman who had been judged quickly and harshly for what was essentially a clerical mistake. As she left the courtroom, Maria kept her head up, but inside her mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the way she had been treated. It wasn't just the fine, it was the way he had dismissed her without a second thought, the way his eyes barely met hers, and when they did, it was filled with a coldness she had come to recognize all too well. It wasn't just a fine, it was a reminder of how far the system still had to go to truly be fair. Maria spent the next few days in quiet reflection as the harshness of the fine settled in her mind. It wasn't just the money or the inconvenience of the situation, it was the stark reminder of the inequities she had faced throughout her life and her career. She had worked hard to overcome them, yet they always seemed to find a way to show up in the most unexpected places. Like this courtroom, the harsh reality of what had just happened didn't sit well with her, but she knew she couldn't let it consume her. She had more important matters to focus on. Maria wasn't just a defendant in the courtroom, she was also a highly respected attorney and a rising star in the legal world. She had earned her position through years of tireless effort, overcoming obstacles placed in her path because of her race, gender, and background. She had been through law school, on scholarships, working 2 jobs to make ends meet, and even after becoming a practicing attorney, she faced constant challenges from clients who doubted her abilities because of her race, from colleagues who underestimated her, and from a system that often seemed stacked against her. Despite the hardships she had encountered, Maria was determined to make a difference in the legal world. She had a sharp mind and a fierce sense of justice, and she had built a reputation as someone who fought for what was right, Even when it wasn't easy, it was part of the reason she had decided to accept the offer to become a judge, a role that many of her colleagues had urged her to take. She knew it would be an uphill battle, but she also knew that she could use the position to challenge the biases and systemic issues she had seen firsthand. In the days following her appearance in Judge Fenton's courtroom, Maria found herself poring over case files in her office at the courthouse. The job she now held as a judge required an immense amount of focus and responsibility, and though she was still adjusting to the weight of the position, she was committed to her work. It was during one of her late nights at the office that she stumbled upon something that would change everything for her. The case she was reviewing that day was a complaint filed against Judge Fenton himself. At first, Mariah didn't think much of it, but as she read through the complaint, her stomach tightened. The allegations were serious. A group of civil rights activists had gathered evidence suggesting that Judge Fenton had been making racially biased decisions in his rulings and that his treatment of black defendants was particularly harsh. The complaint specifically mentioned the fine he had imposed on her just a few days earlier as part of a pattern of behavior that raised questions about his ability to be impartial. Maria's heart raced as she read through the details. It was clear that the complaint wasn't just a simple grievance, it was a call for accountability and for a deeper examination of the judicial system. She had heard whispers about Judge Fenton's reputation, but to see it laid out so clearly in front of her was something else entirely. She couldn't ignore the fact that she had been directly impacted by his actions, and now she was in the unique position to do something about it. The discovery left Maria feeling a mix of anger and determination. She knew the importance of fairness in the courtroom and the responsibility that came with her position as a judge. She had to be objective, but she also couldn't ignore the reality that the man who had just fined her was now the subject of an investigation. She had to proceed carefully and thoughtfully, but in that moment she made a silent promise to herself that she would not allow his actions to go unchecked. As Maria closed the file and leaned back in her chair, she felt a sense of resolve wash over her. This wasn't just about her or the fine anymore. It was about something much larger, the integrity of the entire system, and she was prepared to fight for it no matter what it took. The next morning, as Maria walked into the courthouse, the weight of the case she had uncovered hung heavy on her shoulders. It was one thing to hear whispers about a judge's biases, but it was another entirely to have the proof laid out in front of her. She had spent the previous evening combing through the allegations, the testimonies, and the patterns of Judge Fenton's rulings. She had already seen the inconsistencies in his decisions, but now she was faced with something far more personal, his treatment of her. As a newly appointed judge, Maria had prepared herself for the many challenges of the role, but she had never imagined that she would be called to review the conduct of a colleague, especially one whose actions had directly affected her. The complaints against Judge Fenton painted a picture of a man who, despite his long career, had never truly faced the consequences of his behavior. His rulings, according to the civil rights activists who had filed the complaint, were often harsher for black defendants. The details in the file were disturbing but undeniable. Maria set the file aside for a moment, her mind racing. She had spent her entire career fighting for fairness, equity, and justice. She had advocated for those whose voices had been silenced, and now she was in the position to be the one who could make a real difference. But it wasn't going to be easy. Judge Fenton was a powerful figure in the courthouse, and his colleagues respected him, perhaps even feared him. Challenging him would risk her own reputation, her career, and even her personal safety. But Maria couldn't let that stop her. The integrity of the system was at stake, and she had been given a rare opportunity to correct a wrong. She took a deep breath and opened the file again. The case against Fenton was straightforward, too straightforward. The activists had collected testimonies from multiple defendants who had experienced disproportionate punishments under his rulings. They had gathered records of his fines, his sentences, and the racial disparities that existed in his court. It wasn't just the fine he had imposed on her that was under scrutiny, but a pattern of behavior that suggested bias, conscious or unconscious. Maria knew she had to approach this carefully. She was still new to her position, and any action she took would be scrutinized. If she moved too quickly, it could be seen as a personal vendetta, a chance to get back at a judge who had wronged her. But if she did nothing, it would mean allowing that same bias to persist unchecked. Maria wasn't the type of person who could turn a blind eye, no matter the cost. After hours of deliberation, she decided the next step would be to bring the matter to the attention of her colleagues on the Judicial Review Panel. She couldn't do this alone, and she knew she needed support. Her reputation for fairness would be key in persuading them to take the allegations seriously. If she could gather enough backing from her fellow judges, they could open a formal investigation into Fenton's behavior. But first, she had to get the facts in order. She needed more evidence. Maria went over the testimonies again, marking key points and preparing her arguments. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. This was bigger than her own personal experience. It was about ensuring that the judicial system worked fairly for everyone, regardless of their race. She had made up her mind. This wasn't just about confronting Judge Fenton. It was about confronting a broken system that allowed such biases to thrive unchecked. Maria would be the one to challenge it, even if it meant putting her career on the line. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. As Maria continued to sift through the case against Judge Fenton, her mind kept circling back to the day she had stood in his courtroom. She could still feel the tension in the air, the coldness in his gaze as he handed down the fine without hesitation. It wasn't just the decision itself that troubled her. It was the complete lack of acknowledgement, the dismissiveness with which he had treated her. She had been reduced to another case file, just another name on a list. That moment had been a stark reminder of how easily the system could strip someone of their humanity, especially when they weren't given the benefit of the doubt. As a Black woman, Maria had experienced this feeling more times than she could count, but it stung more coming from someone in a position of power, someone who was supposed to embody fairness. Her thoughts were interrupted when her office door creaked open. One of her clerks, Marcus, walked in holding a thick folder. He was young, eager, and idealistic, a contrast to the world-weary attorneys and judges Maria had encountered throughout her career. He had joined her chambers just a few months ago, and he already showed signs of the same determination that had helped her rise through the ranks. "I've pulled the data on Judge Fenton's past rulings," Marcus said, setting the folder on her desk. "I thought it might help you when you're reviewing the case." Maria smiled at him, grateful for his dedication. "Thanks, Marcus. Let's see what we've got." She opened the folder, scanning through the statistics. The numbers were damning. Clear disparities in Fenton's sentencing, particularly in cases involving Black defendants. The fines he imposed were higher, the sentences longer, and the leniency that seemed to characterize his treatment of white defendants was glaringly absent when it came to people of color. It was hard to ignore the pattern that had emerged, especially when the data was laid out so plainly. "This isn't just coincidence, is it?" she muttered, more to herself than to Marcus. "No, it's not," Marcus replied quietly. "It looks pretty bad, Maria." Maria closed the folder, her mind racing. She had seen systemic biases before, but to see it so clearly in front of her felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a case of simple errors or misjudgments. It was a pattern of behavior that had been going on for years. Judge Fenton's rulings had affected dozens, maybe even hundreds of people, and now she was in the position to do something about it. Maria leaned back in her chair, taking a moment to collect herself. This was more than just a personal grievance. This was about upholding the integrity of the justice system. She had dedicated her life to fighting for fairness, and now she had a responsibility to hold a fellow judge accountable. But the path ahead was fraught with challenges. Judge Fenton had been in the system for decades. He had friends, allies, and a long history of decisions that were respected, if not always questioned. Challenging him would not be easy. "I need to take this to the review panel," Maria said firmly, looking at Marcus. "But we need to make sure we have all the facts lined up. I'll need more testimonies, more evidence. We can't afford to miss anything." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of what she was asking. He had seen the depth of her commitment to justice, and he respected her decision to take on such a difficult case. As Maria set her sights on the review panel, she couldn't help but wonder what would come next. Would she be able to build a case strong enough to bring down a respected judge? Could she stand up against the power and influence he wielded? The stakes had never been higher, but Maria was prepared to fight, not just for herself, but for all those who had been unfairly treated, whose voices had been silenced by those in power. The day of the hearing arrived faster than Maria anticipated. The courthouse was bustling with activity, the usual chaos of lawyers and defendants filling the halls. But today there was a palpable tension in the air, an unspoken awareness that something significant was about to unfold. Maria sat at her desk in her chambers, reviewing her notes one last time. She had carefully prepared her case, making sure every piece of evidence was solid, every witness statement accounted for. The weight of the responsibility was heavy, but she had long ago accepted the burden of fighting for justice. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and it was Marcus, her ever-reliable clerk. "Maria, Judge Fenton is in the courtroom. He's already seated and waiting for you." Maria's stomach tightened. She had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, she couldn't ignore the irony. The judge who had fined her, who had dismissed her so coldly, was now sitting before her, unaware that she would be the one to hold him accountable. She took a deep breath and stood up, straightening her robes, ready to walk into the lion's den. As she stepped into the courtroom, all eyes turned toward her. Maria's presence behind the bench was commanding, her calm demeanor belying the storm of emotions swirling within her. She glanced at the defendant's table, where Judge Fenton sat, his usual confident expression now tinged with a hint of unease. He stood up as she entered, and they exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance. There was no warmth in his gaze, no acknowledgement of the irony of the situation. He was, as always a judge, detached and authoritative. "Judge Fenton," Maria began, her voice steady, "this hearing is now in session. We are here to review the complaints brought before this court regarding your rulings, particularly the concerns about racial bias in your decisions." Fenton's eyes narrowed for a moment, and then he nodded, folding his hands in front of him. He had likely expected this to be a straightforward review, but the tension between them was undeniable. He had no idea how deeply the investigation would cut into his actions, nor that the woman seated before him was the same one he had fined only days ago. "As you are aware," Maria continued, "this case involves several allegations against you, including the claim that your rulings have been disproportionately harsh toward Black defendants. Specifically, we are reviewing the fine you imposed on Maria Williams for a traffic violation and the broader pattern of your decisions in similar cases." Fenton's face hardened, but he kept his composure. He didn't interrupt, though his jaw clenched slightly. He had been a judge for years, and this was not how he envisioned his career being scrutinized. But he knew better than to interrupt. This was Maria's courtroom now. "Judge Williams," he said, his voice measured but clearly defensive, "I have always ruled based on the facts presented to me in each case. I'm not one to impose fines or sentences lightly. My record speaks for itself." Maria didn't flinch. She had anticipated his defense, but she was prepared to counter it with evidence. "Judge Fenton," she began, her tone calm but firm, "it's not the individual rulings that we're questioning, but the pattern that has emerged in your decisions. We've reviewed the data, and the disparities are glaring. Your fines for Black defendants are consistently higher than those imposed on white defendants for similar offenses. This is not a coincidence." The courtroom fell silent. Even Fenton's usual air of invincibility seemed to crack for a moment. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he didn't speak. Maria could see the battle inside him. He was calculating his next move, trying to figure out how to escape this. "We also have testimony from several individuals who have been directly affected by your rulings," Maria continued, her eyes locking with Fenton's. "These people were treated unfairly, not because of the law, but because of bias in your decisions. This is the reality we are facing, Judge Fenton. This is why we are here." For a moment, the weight of her words seemed to sink in. Judge Fenton didn't respond immediately, his face unreadable. Maria watched him carefully, knowing this was just the beginning. She had to remain focused, poised, and relentless. There was no room for doubt. She was the judge now, and it was her job to ensure that justice was done, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. The room remained silent as Maria's words hung in the air, her gaze unwavering from Judge Fenton. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The courtroom, usually a place of formality and distance, now felt like a battleground. Maria was no longer just a defendant or a new judge. She was the embodiment of the justice she had fought for her entire career. Her resolve was unshakable, but she knew this was only the beginning of a long and difficult process. Judge Fenton shifted in his seat, but for a long moment, he didn't speak. His eyes darted toward the lawyers in the room, perhaps hoping for an ally to step in or a way out. There was none. The evidence was overwhelming, and the pattern was undeniable. He had been cornered, and now he had no choice but to face the truth of his actions. "You're accusing me of racial bias," Judge Fenton said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a trace of defensiveness in his words. "I have always tried to be fair. I have been in this position for over 20 years, and I've seen it all. You're saying my experience doesn't count, that I'm just another person who doesn't know how to rule without prejudice." Maria could feel the arrogance in his words, the thin veneer of self-righteousness that he had cloaked himself in for years. But she wasn't here to entertain his excuses. She wasn't here to listen to him justify his actions with empty rhetoric. "No, Judge Fenton," she replied, her voice measured but resolute. "I'm saying that your actions, your rulings, have been shaped by biases that you have not acknowledged, and it is those biases that have led to unjust decisions. You may have tried to be fair, but fairness isn't about intention, it's about outcomes." The silence in the courtroom deepened. Maria's words were sharp, cutting through the years of complacency that had allowed Fenton's actions to go unchecked. There was no room for sympathy here. She wasn't trying to tear him down for personal reasons. She was holding him accountable for the harm he had caused. She turned to the panel of judges behind her. All eyes were now on them, and Maria knew that their decision today could change everything. She had prepared for this moment, had prepared for the challenge of not just confronting Fenton, but making sure the system would hold him accountable. But even in her resolve, she couldn't ignore the way the tension in the room had shifted. They were all watching, waiting to see how this would play out. Maria nodded at the clerk to begin calling in the testimonies. One by one, individuals who had been impacted by Judge Fenton's rulings took the stand. There was Robert Harris, a man who had been fined $500 for a parking violation, while a white defendant with a similar record had only been given a warning. Then came Sheila Thompson, a young woman whose sentence for a minor drug offense had been inexplicably harsher than others in similar circumstances. Each testimony was a blow to Fenton's defense, each one chipping away at the walls he had carefully built around himself. The more testimonies that were presented, the clearer it became. Maria wasn't just upholding the law. She was fighting for those who had been wronged, who had been dismissed and ignored for far too long. The pain in their voices, the frustration and hopelessness they carried, was a stark reminder of the work that still needed to be done. This wasn't just a matter of individual wrongs. It was a reflection of a systemic problem that ran deeper than anyone could have anticipated. Judge Fenton remained silent as the testimonies continued. His earlier confidence had started to fade, replaced by a growing unease that he couldn't hide. The evidence against him was too strong, too overwhelming. The panel of judges exchanged looks, and Maria could feel the shift. They were beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. As the final testimony concluded, Maria stood, her voice steady but filled with purpose. "We've heard the evidence, and it's clear that Judge Fenton's actions have caused harm. The question now is what we will do about it. We cannot let bias dictate the outcomes of our courts. It is time for accountability." The room held its breath, the weight of her words hanging in the air as Maria awaited the panel's decision. She had done all she could. Now, it was up to them. The panel of judges sat in silence, the weight of Maria's words hanging in the air. She could feel the tension in the room, the collective attention on the decision that would follow. Maria had done everything she could, presenting irrefutable evidence, powerful testimonies, and a compelling argument. It was now up to the other judges to determine the outcome. Her heart raced, but she steadied herself. She had known this would be the hardest part. She had spent her entire career navigating a system that often failed to see people like her. And now she was asking it to hold one of its own accountable. Judge Fenton sat motionless, his hands folded in front of him. His face was a study in composure, but there was no mistaking the nervous energy beneath it. He had been a judge for decades, his reputation long unchallenged. Now, in the face of the evidence, he seemed small, his usual air of authority diminished. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the other judges, but he didn't speak. His silence was deafening. The head judge, a tall, middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, finally broke the silence. His voice was calm but firm as he addressed the room. "Judge Williams, we have heard the testimonies and reviewed the evidence. This is a serious matter, and we understand the gravity of the situation. Judge Fenton, your record is now under scrutiny in ways it never has been before. This review is about more than just one case or one individual. It is about the integrity of this court and the trust the public places in us." Maria held her breath as the head judge paused, allowing the words to settle in the room. Every eye was on him, and he was clearly aware of the importance of his next words. Maria had come so far, but now it felt as though everything was suspended, hanging by a thread. "Judge Fenton," the head judge continued, "you've been presented with a body of evidence that demonstrates a consistent pattern of disparity in your rulings, particularly in cases involving Black defendants. We take such matters very seriously. A judge is expected to exercise impartiality, not only in appearance but in practice. The court will not tolerate decisions that show bias, intentional or otherwise." Fenton's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, his pride perhaps keeping him from protesting further. Maria could see the internal battle he was facing. The man who had long controlled the courtroom was now being confronted with his actions, and it was clear he wasn't sure how to defend himself. The head judge turned his attention to the other members of the panel. Maria could see their faces. Some were skeptical, others contemplative, but none seemed willing to side with Fenton. "We've come to a decision," the head judge said, his voice resolute. "Judge Fenton, effective immediately, you are suspended from the bench. You will face a full disciplinary review, and the allegations of racial bias against you will be fully investigated. The court will not allow any form of discrimination to go unchallenged. You will be given the opportunity to defend yourself, but the facts presented here today are too serious to ignore." There was a collective murmur in the room, a mix of surprise and approval. Maria's heart swelled with a sense of vindication. She had known this would be a difficult battle, but to see her efforts result in this moment, this was more than just personal justice. It was a statement that the system, flawed as it was, could still be held accountable. Judge Fenton stood up slowly, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. He didn't say a word as he turned and exited the courtroom, leaving behind a stunned silence. Maria watched him go, but it wasn't a feeling of triumph that washed over her. It was a deep sense of relief that the right decision had been made and that the voices of the people who had been silenced for so long had finally been heard. As the panel adjourned, Maria remained seated for a moment, taking in the weight of the decision. It wasn't over yet. There would be a formal investigation, and Judge Fenton still had his opportunity to defend himself. But today, Maria had made a stand that would ripple through the legal system and remind everyone of the importance of integrity, fairness, and accountability. The fight wasn't finished, but for now, Maria knew she had won a critical victory. In the days following Judge Fenton's suspension, the courthouse was abuzz with whispers. News of the decision spread quickly, with some celebrating the long-overdue accountability, while others expressed shock and disbelief. Maria knew that this victory, though important, was only the beginning of a much larger process. Fenton's disciplinary review would take months, and there were sure to be repercussions, political, social, and professional, for both him and those who had supported him. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. As she sat at her desk, reviewing new cases, her mind drifted back to the hearing. The tension in the room had been palpable, the weight of history pressing down on them all. But Maria's confidence had never wavered. She had walked into that courtroom with the knowledge that she wasn't just fighting for her own sense of justice, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked or mistreated by a system that was supposed to protect them. That knowledge had driven her. Her phone buzzed, snapping her back to the present. It was a message from Marcus. Asterisk Judge Williams, I just wanted to say it again how proud I am of you. You stood up for what was right, and that takes courage. We all see the change you're bringing to this place. Asterisk. She smiled, a sense of warmth filling her chest. Marcus had been with her through some of the toughest moments in the case, always diligent, always supportive. His faith in her reminded her that while one victory couldn't change everything, it could inspire others to keep pushing for progress. She had seen it in his eyes during the hearings, the way he'd watched her with admiration and respect. The next day, the judicial panel met again to discuss the next steps in Fenton's investigation. It was a process that would unfold in stages, with the possibility of disciplinary action, counseling, and even removal from the bench if the allegations were found to be true. Maria was not involved in the investigation itself, but she knew that the outcome would be significant not just for Fenton, but for the entire judicial system. The case had already exposed deep flaws that could no longer be ignored. Despite the success of the hearing, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one battle in a much longer war. There were many more judges like Fenton who had never faced scrutiny, many more systems of power that continued to operate unchecked. And while today's decision was a step forward, it was clear that the fight for justice was far from over. The road to reform would be long and complicated, but Maria was prepared for it. One afternoon, as she walked through the courthouse lobby, she passed a group of young lawyers gathered by the entrance. One of them, an African-American woman in her late 20s, caught Maria's eye. The woman smiled and walked up to her, extending her hand. Judge Williams, I just wanted to thank you, she said. What you did, what you're doing, it's inspiring. I'm just starting out, but seeing you take action makes me believe that things can actually change. We can actually make a difference. Maria shook the woman's hand, a deep sense of gratitude welling up inside her. Thank you, Maria replied softly. You're the future of this profession. Keep fighting for what's right. As the woman walked away, Maria stood there for a moment, watching her go. There was hope in the air, a sense that the walls of the system were starting to crack. The work was just beginning, but she had made her mark. She had been the one to challenge the bias, to bring it to the surface for the world to see. She had been the one to remind everyone that justice wasn't just about the law, it was about the people it was meant to serve. In that moment, Maria knew that even if her battle wasn't over, she had already won something far more important than a single case. She had won the belief that change was possible.